Alright, today marks the first day that I've actually had a car in the garage since I moved into the house, and I just tell you right now, it's awesome having an indoor space to work on cars like this. This is my sister's car. It's a 2009 Mazda CX7. Anyway, there doesn't really seem to be a lot of good information on the internet about how to replace wheel bearings, especially the front wheel bearings in the Mazda CX7, so that's what I'm making this video about. I knew it was the front wheel bearing because I took it for a test drive down the road, and once I hit 40 miles an hour and above, I just heard this constant whooshing sound, and you listen very closely to where that sound's coming from, and I could clearly tell it was coming from the front left portion of the car, so front left wheel bearing. Pretty straightforward. Now, I've never replaced a wheel bearing on this car before, so I bought a new wheel bearing, and this kind of came as a kit with a new hub. Also, a new snap ring, and I believe this is the locking nut for the CV axle, which I'm not 100% sure, but I'm about 90% sure that's what it's for. Also, I'm not 100% sure if I'm going to need these forks, but I bought a set of forks just in case we need them, and then obviously, you know, you're going to need a bunch of tools to get the job done. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the tire off and start taking this car apart. Okay, so there's a lot of things we got to do in order to get to the bearing. One of the first things that we got to do is we got to remove these two screws, which I don't think these screws are really that important. I believe they just come on the brake disc from the factory to kind of hold it on there during assembly, but most people will put it back on there anyway. Probably a good thing to do. Anyway, to crack these loose, you may have to get a little creative. What I do, I have a screwdriver. There's a little hole in the screwdriver. I put another screwdriver through that screwdriver just to gain more leverage. By the way, these are number 3 Phillips screws. I just gave this a couple taps with the hammer. You can also take the end of the hammer and hit the head of the screw directly. And then from here, get it on the head, a couple taps. I already cracked these loose off camera, but you get the idea. They may not come out. If they don't come out, then you could try and use some type of extractor, which good luck with that. Otherwise, another option is you could try and weld a stud onto them, or you could just drill them out. Honestly, I think you'd be fine drilling them out, but you know what? Don't take my word for it. Next, you're going to want to completely remove the brake caliper, and this comes off in 2 portions. First thing you're going to want to do is get a 17mm socket, remove this bolt, and there's a second one right here, also 17, and then this portion will come out, and then you want to take out the other piece of the brake caliper bracket, and this comes off with a 19mm socket. There's 2 bolts, one right here, and again, one on the underside. If you're anything like me where you don't have any fancy air tools or any of those fancy electronic impacts, a tool that you really should have is just a simple 2-foot breaker bar. And the great thing about this breaker bar is it has a head that'll swivel past 90 degrees, and this is great for getting bolts like these where they require a lot of torque to get them off. So, put my 17 on, lift up. I got that one broke loose, and then I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom. Sometimes it's a good idea to give these a little shock with the hammer. In my eyes, that just helps break them loose. That came out fine. Take this off the rest of the way now. Now we can take off the brake rotor. You may have to smack that with a hammer. Now is a great time to inspect your brakes, which I'm going to be doing a complete brake job on this car in the coming weeks. That looks fine for now. Now, I'm thinking the next thing I'm going to do is there is a nut that goes on the CV axle, and I can see that the previous mechanic that replaced this wheel bearing bent over this ridge of this nut onto the axle itself to prevent that nut from backing out. So what I got to do is just unfold that lip to allow me to easily take this nut off there, which, I mean, it just pretty much came apart right there. So I got to see if I have a socket big enough to crack this nut, and we'll take that off. Well, I was hoping to get this CV axle nut off with a monkey wrench or an adjustable wrench, but I had no luck with that. I didn't really care about screwing up the nut or the hub because I'm replacing both of them. But I was unsuccessful in removing this nut, so Tractor Supply got me by the balls tonight. About $22. I have an 1 7/16 inch socket, which I know for a fact this nut is metric, but they didn't have any metric sockets this big, so this should work. And I also had to get a 3/4 inch to 1/2 inch reducer because I don't have anything I don't have anything 3/4 inch drive. So let's hope this works. That's pretty tight. I'm thinking I may need to put some heat on there. I think heat is definitely the thing to do because I don't want to pop this socket. That would suck. Yep, put some heat on her. That's in there pretty darn tight. Ah, there she is. All right. Got her. Sometimes you need heat. I'm going to use that nut to beat the CV axle, or at least get the CV axle loose. So you spin the nut off just enough so that when you swing the hammer on the nut, you're not making contact with the stud. And that worked out just fine. That CV axle is nice and loose. So I'm going to remove this nut off completely now, and I'm going to be careful with that nut because it's very hot. I'll just slide it out of the way somewhere that I'm not going to come in contact with it. And we'll move on to the next step here. Alright, there's a couple more things we got to do before we can access that bearing in the hub. Next, I'm going to remove these two 19mm bolts, which I sprayed those with some nut buster. And we also have the tie rod end. That's got to come off, and then there's another bolt. Well, it's more like a ball joint that's down here, which I've never really worked on one like that before. It's kind of strange. So let's get to the other two connections first, and then we'll get to this bottom one and see how that goes. This upper 19 came off fine, the bottom one's giving me trouble, so we're going to go back to the hot wrench here. Spin it on the back. That wants to be difficult. Alright, I think I got her now. Hot wrench definitely helps. I'll show you what I did to prevent it from spinning on the other side. 19mm box wrench, and I left the top stud in, and it's just kind of resting against that top stud. Gotta do what you gotta do when you're single-handed. Okay, for this tie rod, there was a little clip like that, which I just took off with the screwdriver. Now I believe it's a 17. I already got a crack, and hopefully it's not spinning, which I don't think it is. So far so good. So I'm going to go with the unprofessional technique of knocking this nut, or backing off this nut till it's just above the top of the threads yet again. I'll take a hammer and knock this through, and hopefully all goes well. doesn't go super easy. I can see somebody's hit this before on the side of the housing, so give the housing a couple good whacks. There it goes. Alright, there's just one more component that I gotta take off. Also another note, while you're here, this is your ABS/wheel speed sensor, which I believe in the front is probably just an ABS sensor. And the previous mechanic that worked on this broke off the stud for this ABS sensor, and they used RTV to seal this in here. So as opposed to ripping that out of that RTV, I've decided to remove the plug on the other side, which that's pretty simple. And I'll just try and be very careful not to break that when I'm replacing the bearing and hub. So now I think I can get the CV axle somewhat out of the way, and we'll move back to the other side and try and take off that last component. Alright, I got this piece completely off. Unfortunately, I did not catch it on camera, but I'm going to tell you what the trick is. Alright, so the trick is you're going to want to take this bolt out all the way. And after you get that bolt out all the way, then you're able to get a flathead screwdriver in there a good bit. And then just bend that screwdriver, and if you have enough upward pressure on this whole housing with the ratchet strap, you get to a point where you pull that screwdriver back and this thing literally just shot up. So, good news. Now, we can take this whole assembly onto the workbench and we'll get to work on removing that bearing and hub. Alright, so this is how I'm going to get the hub out of here. So I have two pieces of, this is probably, I think it's 3.5, maybe 4-inch square steel tube. And I propped up this whole housing onto these two pieces. Now, what's going to happen, these are going to want to spread apart. So what I did, took a couple of wood clamp here, wood clamp there. And now, whenever I hammer down on this hub, it should stay fixed. And what I've done, I've gone through my sockets and I found a socket that is just about the right size, maybe a little bit smaller than the, what do you want to call that? The diameter of the hub. So I'm just going to have that on there like that. I don't want to hold this. It's not that I'm a bad shot. It's just a lot of shock and vibrations going through here and I don't really want to lose a finger. So I went through my blacksmithing tools and I found this pair of tongs. And this is going to hold the socket like this. So I'm going to hold the socket and take that little sledgehammer right there, or mallet, whatever you want to call it. And we'll see if we can knock out this hub. We got to move on to the bearing next. There she is. All right. All right, so here's what's left of the old hub, piece of the inner bearing race on there. Here's some of the ball bearings. That would be the outer portion of the bearing. I can still see the inner ball bearings and inner part of the bearing still present. There's a snap ring in here which needs to be removed, and then I can work on getting the rest of that bearing out of there. Probably not the smartest way I did this, really I was just trying to show you guys how to, get through this job if you're kind of like a home handyman mechanic like me and you don't have, much of these fancy mechanics tools. So yeah, now I got to take this snap ring off. This is the new snap ring, so I've got to chisel that off and just work on getting the rest of this bearing out of here, which I'm going to do that off camera. It's slow going, painful. As for putting the new hub and bearing in there, I would highly recommend that you find a buddy with a press, or even if you go to like a professional mechanic shop, what are they going to charge you to use their press to press that in? 20, 30 bucks. I think it's worth it, definitely, to press the new bearing in there. I mean, you can get it in there with a hammer, but it puts a lot of shock on the bearing, and I think ultimately it's going to cause premature failure of the wheel bearing. So honestly, you know, just find somebody with a press and press it in. For getting it out, I mean, absolutely, go to town with a sledgehammer like I did. You can definitely do it. I beat the crap out of my socket. This is an inch and a quarter 3/8 drive. I'm just curious if I can still fit an extension bar into it. And it goes in there just, oh wait a minute, that's not 3/8, it's actually 1/2 inch drive. What am I thinking? Yeah, I definitely mushroomed it over, big time. I think I can get in there with a chisel or something like that and straighten it out so I can fit a 1/2 inch drive thing back over there, but you know. Yeah, you gotta do what you gotta do. Alright, so I got the new bearing and hub in. I want to tell you what exactly happened to me, because the first time I pressed the hub into the new bearing, it didn't work. I blew the new hub that came with this hub and bearing assembly apart. So I had to go down to the auto parts store and get a new bearing and try the whole process again. I learned a little bit, so I want to teach you a little bit here. So when you're pressing in the new bearing, obviously the hub's not going to be in. So what you do, you press the new bearing in from this side. And after you press that bearing in, there's going to be a snap ring like this, and that snaps in and that holds the bearing in place. And then from there, you press the hub in. Now here's where I made the mistake. When I was pressing in the hub, the first time, I only had the spindle assembly supported here, here, and here. So what happened as I was pressing the hub in, all of this pressure of me pushing the hub in was going against the ball bearings. And in turn, what happened is the bearings separated, and I absolutely destroyed the bearing. So I had to punch it back out and get a new bearing. So what you should do in order to prevent that from happening is when you're pressing the hub in, I ended up finding a very large washer that fit on here. Basically, you want to support this whole bearing right here with something that matches the exact profile of this bearing, and then put that on the bottom side of your press, so this will be upside down. So when you go to press the hub on, it's only pressing against the bearing and not the whole housing to the spindle here. So that's my mistake. Anyway, I did actually end up taking the ABS sensor out, which I think you guys remember from earlier on in the video. The previous mechanic had broke off the stud for this ABS sensor, and he just put some RTV to hold the thing in there, which I just put some RTV back on there. So this is ready to be reinstalled. Alright, so I have the lower control arm connected as well as the tie rod end connected. Next thing to go in is the CV shaft. But before I insert that into the spindle, I'm going to grease the splines with, this is just some general high temperature disc / brake drum wheel bearing grease. Just going to put a good coat of grease on the splines. I probably should have done the hub before I put the hub in. Oh, it's not too late. I'll just stick my finger in the hub here and grease up the splines in here too. Definitely a good idea to grease this up. Definitely something you want to do. I'm not going to crank down this CV axle nut just yet. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put this strut back in. probably should have had this bolt ready to go. The rest of this is really straightforward. I'm not even really going to bother recording the rest of this. And basically I need to reinstall the ABS sensor, which that's really straightforward. I need to put the rotor back on, the caliper bracket, the brake pads, and then the caliper itself. And then we should be about ready for a test ride. Alright, one important thing you don't want to forget though. This is your CV axle stud. This is your CV axle nut. Okay? There's a flange on this nut. And on the CV axle stud, there's a little cutout right here. So what you want to do, you want to take a punch or something after you, of course, apply the proper amount of torque to this CV axle bolt, which I'm not exactly sure what it is, so I just kind of used my judgment. But what you want to do, you want to take a punch and you want to just fold over this flange a little bit into this little channel. And this is just to lock this nut in here and make sure that it's not going to back out over time. Just like so. That's not going anywhere.